I never thought my world could crumble in a single moment, but it did. It started like any other day: work, dinner, putting the kids to bed. The kind of predictable routine I had come to appreciate. I thought I had a stable life, a loving wife, 2 amazing kids, and a close circle of friends. But all of that was an illusion. The night I found out, I was fixing the sink in the kitchen while Karen, my wife, was upstairs working late on her laptop. Or so she claimed. She had been distracted lately, forgetting little things, brushing off questions about her schedule, snapping at me over nothing. I chalked it up to stress from her job, but the uneasy feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I decided to check on her, mostly to offer her a cup of tea. As I climbed the stairs, I noticed her voice, hushed, almost a whisper. I stopped just short of the bedroom door and realized she was on the phone. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but her words froze me in my tracks. "I miss you too," she said softly, almost coy. "No, he's downstairs. Don't worry, he never checks my phone." My heart raced. I stood there, trying to convince myself that I'd misheard. But the giggles, the flirtation, they were undeniable. I opened the door, and she nearly jumped out of her chair, scrambling to close her laptop. "Who were you talking to?" I asked, my voice trembling. "No one. Just work stuff," she said, too quickly. Her eyes darted everywhere but at me. I wasn't buying it. "Let me see your phone." Her hesitation said it all. "Why are you being paranoid? Can't I have a little privacy?" she snapped. "Karen," I said, forcing myself to stay calm, "just give me the phone." She clutched it tightly. "It's nothing. You're overreacting." But I wasn't. I wrestled the phone from her grip, and there it was, the proof I never wanted to see. Messages, pictures, hotel confirmations. And the name at the top of the screen. Steve. My best friend. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. "Steve," I whispered, my voice cracking. "You're cheating on me with Steve?" Her face turned defiant, almost smug. "It's not what you think," she said. "He understands me in a way you never could." "Understands you?" I shouted, my anger finally spilling out. "Karen, we have a family. We have kids. And I'm suffocating in it," she shot back. "Do you know what it's like to feel invisible? To have someone actually see you for the first time in years?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She wasn't even sorry. It was like she had been waiting for this moment to blame me for everything. I stormed out of the room, my mind racing. I couldn't think straight. The betrayal wasn't just hers, it was Steve's too. A man I had trusted with everything. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed in the living room, replaying every moment of our marriage, every sign I might have missed. By morning, I had made a decision. This wasn't going to end quietly. The next day felt like a surreal haze, like I was living someone else's nightmare. I couldn't even look at Karen that morning, but she carried on as if nothing had happened. She got the kids ready for school, kissed them goodbye, and went about her day. I wondered how long she had been doing this, acting like the perfect mother while stabbing me in the back. I spent the morning pacing the house, trying to calm the storm inside me. The anger wasn't just at her, it was at myself for being so blind. I replayed every memory of Steve, every time I had trusted him. The fishing trips, the backyard barbecues, the nights he'd stayed over after a few too many beers. All that time, he was lying to my face, laughing with me, sharing meals with my family, and all the while, he was betraying me. The betrayal ran so deep it felt like a sickness eating away at me. By midday, I knew I couldn't keep it bottled up any longer. I texted Steve to come over, making sure Karen wasn't home. He arrived with that easy grin he always wore, oblivious to what was waiting for him. I couldn't even bring myself to let him inside. I met him on the driveway, and when he saw the look on my face, his smile vanished. The confrontation wasn't planned, but it escalated quickly. My words came out in a torrent, accusing, demanding answers, shouting about how he could betray me like this. At first, he denied it, then he tried to justify it, saying things I couldn't even process through the red haze of my anger. The sound of my own voice, raw and furious, barely registered as I lunged at him. I don't even remember the first punch, just the way my fists moved as years of trust shattered into pieces. The neighbors must have heard the commotion because someone called the cops. By the time they arrived, Steve was on the ground, bloody and bruised, and I was standing over him, breathing heavily, my knuckles split and aching. They arrested me on the spot, and I didn't resist. I barely felt the handcuffs as they led me to the squad car. My mind was elsewhere, spinning with everything that had been taken from me. My marriage, my best friend, my family's stability. Karen bailed me out later that day, but not out of concern or kindness. She was furious, more worried about how it would look to the neighbors and the kids than about what had caused it in the first place. She didn't say much, but her expression spoke volumes. To her, I was the villain now, the one who had overreacted and caused trouble. It didn't matter that she was the one who had betrayed me. In her mind, I had become the problem. The days that followed were a whirlwind of cold indifference and legal paperwork. Karen was quick to file for divorce, painting herself as the victim while I was left scrambling to piece together my side of the story. She moved out soon after, taking the kids with her. I barely had time to say goodbye to them before they were gone, their faces confused and frightened as they clung to their mother. The house, once filled with the sounds of my children's laughter, felt unbearably silent. Every room carried a memory. Movie nights in the living room, bedtime stories in their bedrooms, family dinners at the kitchen table. Now, all of it felt hollow, like a cruel echo of the life I thought I had. Karen made sure to twist the knife even further, spreading her version of events to our friends and family. It didn't take long for people to pick sides, and I found myself alone, isolated by the weight of my anger and shame. I tried to see my kids, but Karen made it difficult. She claimed it was for their well-being, that they needed stability, but I knew it was just another way to punish me. I missed them more than I thought was possible. Every day without them felt like another piece of me was being chipped away. I lived for the moments I could call them, even if the conversations were short and stilted. The divorce proceedings were brutal. Karen's lawyer painted me as unstable and violent, using the incident with Steve as proof. It didn't matter that my actions were the result of betrayal. In the eyes of the court, I was the one in the wrong. She demanded full custody of the kids, and I could already see the writing on the wall. When the divorce was finalized, I was left with almost nothing. Karen got the house, primary custody of the children, and even managed to keep some of my assets. I was allowed supervised visitation, a humiliating reminder of how far I had fallen. The betrayal had taken everything from me. My family, my home, my sense of self. But the worst part was seeing Karen and Steve together, flaunting their new relationship as if they had done nothing wrong. It was as if my pain didn't matter, as if they had rewritten the narrative to make themselves the heroes of some twisted love story. They moved into a new house together, one not far from where I lived, ensuring I'd see them every time I visited the kids. I didn't know how to move forward. Every day felt like a battle just to get out of bed. I told myself I needed to focus on the kids, to fight for more time with them, but the anger and despair were always there, pulling me down. I couldn't let go of what they had done to me. It consumed me, feeding a bitterness I knew would only grow if I let it. What Karen and Steve didn't realize was that I wasn't just angry, I was determined. I didn't know what form it would take, but I knew I couldn't let them win. Not like this. The day I was sentenced felt like the final nail in the coffin of my old life. The charges for the fight with Steve, assault, disorderly conduct, were minor in the grand scheme of things, but the damage was already done. The court wasn't just punishing me for my actions, it was punishing me for the kind of man I had become in their eyes. Karen's lawyer had made sure of that. The jail cell was cold and unwelcoming, but I barely noticed. I spent most of my time replaying the past months in my head, wondering where it had all gone so wrong. The betrayal, the divorce, the custody battle, it all blurred together, forming a heavy weight that pressed down on me. The anger simmered just beneath the surface, but there were moments when it gave way to something darker, hopelessness. I had never thought of myself as a violent man, but sitting in that cell, I wondered if I had been wrong. The image of Steve on the ground, his face bloodied, kept flashing in my mind. I didn't regret hitting him, not for a second, but I hated that it had given Karen the upper hand. She had played her cards perfectly, turning my anger into a weapon against me. The nights were the hardest. Alone with my thoughts, I couldn't escape the memories. I thought of my kids, their faces confused and scared as they were pulled away from me. I thought of Karen, her cold indifference as she packed her things, her blatant disregard for everything we had built together. And I thought of Steve, the man I had once called my best friend, now living the life I had worked so hard to create. In jail, I met men who had lost everything, just like me. Some of them had given in to despair, while others clung to their anger like a lifeline. I found myself in the latter group, though I didn't know what I was holding on to. Revenge, maybe. Or justice. Or perhaps just the simple need to prove to myself that I wasn't broken beyond repair. There were moments of clarity, brief glimpses of something resembling hope. I thought about what kind of man I wanted to be for my kids, about the example I was setting for them. It wasn't just about fighting for custody, It was about fighting for myself, for the life I still wanted to live. But those moments were fleeting, drowned out by the overwhelming bitterness that consumed me. Karen never visited. I didn't expect her to, but it still stung. She had moved on, leaving me to deal with the fallout alone. The few letters I received from my kids were like tiny lifelines, reminding me of what mattered most. Their words were simple, updates about school, drawings of their favorite superheroes, but they meant everything to me. I kept them close, rereading them whenever the loneliness became too much to bear. Time moved slowly, but eventually, my sentence came to an end. Walking out of the jail, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. I was free, but my life was in shambles. I had no home, no job, no family waiting for me. All I had was the weight of my anger and the burning need to make things right. The first few days out were a blur. I stayed at a cheap motel, living off the small amount of money I had left. My first priority was finding work, but that proved to be harder than I'd anticipated. My record was a black mark, and potential employers weren't eager to give me a chance. The rejection only fueled my frustration, reinforcing the feeling that I was trapped in a cycle I couldn't escape. Karen's face was everywhere. In my memories, in the neighborhood where she now lived with Steve, even in the few conversations I had with mutual acquaintances who still pitied me. It was like she had left a permanent mark on my life, one I couldn't scrub away no matter how hard I tried. But I wasn't ready to give up. The time in jail had taught me one thing: survival. I had made it through the darkest days, and now I had to figure out what came next. I didn't know how to rebuild my life, but I knew I couldn't let Karen and Steve define its ruins. They had taken so much from me already. I wouldn't let them take my future too. The bitterness was still there, sharp and unyielding, but it was tempered by a growing determination. I started to make plans, small steps toward something resembling stability. Finding steady work, securing a place to live, and most importantly, finding a way to be there for my kids. I didn't know how long it would take or how many obstacles I would face, but I was determined to try. As I stood outside the motel one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in months: hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me moving forward. Whatever came next, I would face it head-on, armed with the knowledge that I had already survived the worst. Freedom wasn't the fresh start I had imagined. It was more like stepping into a battlefield I wasn't prepared for. Life outside the jail cell was colder than I remembered, harsher, and more unforgiving. Every door I knocked on seemed to slam in my face. Employers were polite at first, but their tone shifted the moment they asked about my background. I'd see the subtle wince, the quiet withdrawal as soon as I mentioned the conviction. No one wanted to hire a man with a record, no matter the circumstances. I found a room to rent in a crumbling old house on the outskirts of town. The place was barely livable. Peeling paint, a heater that only worked when it wanted to, and neighbors who didn't bother to hide their suspicion of the new guy. But it was cheap, and it was all I could afford. Most nights, I lay awake staring at the water-stained ceiling, wondering how I'd fallen so far. My kids' laughter, once a constant in my life, was now just a memory that echoed in the silence of my room. I fought hard to see them, navigating the tight leash the court had put me on. The visits were supervised, stiff, and artificial. The joy I used to feel when I was with them had been replaced by a dull ache. They were happy to see me, I could tell, but there was a distance now, like they didn't quite know how to talk to me anymore. Karen made sure of that. She was always in the background, hovering just out of earshot but close enough to remind me who had the upper hand. When the kids weren't around, my anger crept back in, sharper than ever. I didn't know how to let it go. Every time I passed their new house on my way to visit the kids, I saw the life that had been stolen from me. It wasn't just the betrayal that haunted me, it was the way Karen and Steve carried on as if nothing had happened. They acted like the victims, like I was the one who had wronged them. The sheer audacity of it all made my blood boil. Rumors started spreading around town. Karen had her version of the story, carefully crafted to make me look like an unstable monster. Steve was the perfect accomplice, charming and smooth, always quick to flash a grin and shake a hand. They built their narrative brick by brick, ensuring that by the time I showed my face in public, people already had their minds made up about me. Friends I had known for years avoided me. Even casual acquaintances crossed the street to avoid having to make small talk. I was a pariah, and they had made sure of it. To keep myself afloat, I took whatever work I could find. Scrubbing floors, unloading trucks, fixing roofs. It wasn't much, but it gave me just enough to cover rent and keep the lights on. My body ached from the constant labor, but it was better than being idle. Work gave me something to focus on, something to distract me from the thoughts that threatened to consume me. Every now and then, I'd hear whispers about Karen and Steve. People loved to gossip, and I couldn't help but listen when I overheard their names. They were living well, throwing parties, taking vacations. They didn't just take my family, they took the life I had worked so hard to build. It made my struggle feel even heavier, my losses even more unbearable. But I wasn't just angry. Beneath the bitterness was something deeper, something I hadn't fully acknowledged until now. I missed being a father, really being a father. I missed bedtime stories and Saturday morning cartoons, school projects and family road trips. Karen had taken all of that from me, but I wasn't going to let her take it forever. I didn't know how, but I was determined to find a way to reconnect with my kids. They were the only thing keeping me from sinking entirely. One day, I was working on a construction site when my phone buzzed. It was a picture message from Karen, a snapshot of my son's soccer game. He was smiling, holding up a trophy, surrounded by teammates. She had added a caption, "He did great today." There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain she had caused, just a casual update as if everything between us was fine. It was infuriating and heartbreaking all at once. I stared at that picture for a long time, longer than I should have. He looked so happy, so full of life. It hurt to know I wasn't there to see it, to cheer him on from the sidelines. I saved the picture to my phone though. As much as it hurt, it was a reminder of why I couldn't give up. I started keeping a notebook, jotting down every idea, every plan I could think of to get back on my feet. I knew I couldn't fight Karen in court until I had a stable job and a better place to live. It felt impossible, but I forced myself to believe it wasn't. I thought about the kids constantly, what they'd want from me, how I could be the kind of father they deserved despite everything. And yet, in the back of my mind, the anger still lingered. It wasn't enough to just rebuild my life. I wanted them to feel some of what I had felt. Karen and Steve had walked away unscathed while I was left to pick up the pieces. It didn't feel fair. It didn't feel right. That bitterness became a quiet passenger, sitting in the corner of my mind, waiting for its moment. But for now, survival came first. I worked harder, saved every penny I could, and pushed myself to keep going, even on the days when it felt pointless. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let them destroy me completely. Life didn't get easier, but it started to shift in subtle, unexpected ways. I kept my head down, grinding through long days at work and longer nights wrestling with loneliness. Progress was slow, but it was there. I saved enough to move into a small apartment. Not much, but better than the room I'd been renting. My focus remained on two things: building a life stable enough to regain more time with my kids and, in darker moments, letting the bitterness toward Karen and Steve simmer quietly, biding its time. It was around this period that I began hearing whispers. At first, they came through casual remarks from mutual acquaintances I hadn't completely lost. Then, small-town gossip started trickling my way, tales of cracks forming in Karen and Steve's perfect life. I wasn't actively seeking out information, it just seemed to find me. And while I didn't celebrate their misfortunes outright, I won't lie, it felt like the universe was finally evening the score. The first sign of trouble came when Steve lost his job. He had always been good at charming his way through situations, but charm doesn't last forever. A management shakeup at his company left him on the chopping block, and for the first time, he had to confront something I'd been dealing with for months: rejection. From what I heard, his confidence took a hit. People said he seemed different, less cocky, more subdued. I imagined him sitting at home, struggling with the same sense of failure and inadequacy that had been my daily companion. Somehow, it felt fitting. Not long after, Karen's own job began demanding longer hours, more responsibilities. I wasn't sure if she took the extra load out of necessity, now that Steve was unemployed, or if she was simply trying to prove something, to him, to herself, or maybe to the world. Either way, it was clear that the strain was wearing on her. She looked tired when I saw her at the few supervised visits with the kids. There was less of the smug superiority she used to wear like armor. Instead, she seemed distracted, almost irritable, like the life she had chosen wasn't living up to her expectations. One evening, as I was scrolling through my phone in the quiet of my apartment, I came across a news story. Steve's name was there, buried in a local article about a minor scandal at his old company. Nothing illegal, but shady enough to tarnish his reputation. It was strange seeing his name in print like that, so public and exposed. I wondered how Karen was handling it, whether she was still proudly standing by him or starting to see cracks in the man she had left me for. The gossip escalated when I learned their new house, a shiny modern place they had moved into right after the divorce, had been hit with financial troubles. Mortgage payments had fallen behind, and there were whispers of foreclosure. Karen, who had always been so careful to present herself as successful and put together, now had neighbors quietly questioning her choices. It wasn't lost on me that this was the same house I'd driven past countless times, a glaring reminder of everything I'd lost. The thought of it slipping away from them stirred something I couldn't quite name. Satisfaction. Closure. Maybe just relief. And then there was the car accident. Nothing major, just a fender bender from what I heard, but enough to add another layer of stress to their already unraveling life. Karen's car was in the shop for weeks, forcing her to juggle rides and carpools for the kids. It was a small inconvenience, but it painted a picture of a life that wasn't as seamless as she wanted the world to believe. I didn't feel sorry for her, not really. She had chosen this path. She had chosen Steve. There were moments when I wondered if any of this was my doing, not directly, of course, but through sheer willpower or the quiet force of resentment I carried with me every day. I'd be lying if I said I didn't entertain the thought of nudging fate along. A few anonymous tips to certain parties, perhaps a carefully timed suggestion here or there to the right people. Nothing illegal, nothing overtly malicious, just small pushes to set the wheels turning. Whether it was luck, karma, or my own subtle interference, the outcome was the same. Their life wasn't as perfect as they'd made it out to be. But there was another side to this, one I couldn't ignore. Every time I felt a spark of satisfaction at their misfortunes, I was reminded of what really mattered: my kids. None of this was their fault, and they were caught in the middle of a mess they hadn't asked for. I hated that they had to see their mother struggle, that their lives were being shaped by choices Karen and I had made. It wasn't fair to them, and it weighed on me more than I liked to admit. One night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the small collection of drawings and crafts my kids had made during our visits. They were my lifeline, my reminder of why I couldn't let the anger consume me completely. As much as I wanted Karen and Steve to feel the weight of their actions, I knew that holding on to revenge wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't bring back the life I'd lost, and it wouldn't make me the father my kids deserved. Still, the bitterness lingered, like a shadow I couldn't quite shake. Their misfortunes didn't bring me peace, only a fleeting sense of vindication that faded as quickly as it came. I wasn't sure what I was chasing anymore: justice, closure, or something else entirely. But one thing was certain: I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. And soon it would. I didn't expect my life to change the day I met Ellen. In fact, I barely noticed her at first. She was just another face in the sterile bureaucratic maze of probation meetings and court-mandated check-ins. After months of struggling to find stable ground, these appointments felt like another hoop to jump through, another reminder of how much I had lost. But Ellen was different. Calm, patient, and surprisingly understanding in a world where I had grown used to judgment and dismissal. Ellen was my probation officer, assigned to oversee my progress after jail. I expected her to be cold and detached, someone who would look at me like the rest of the world did, a broken man who'd brought this mess on himself. But from the moment she introduced herself, there was something about her that disarmed me. She didn't rush through our conversations or treat me like a checkbox on her to-do list. She listened, really listened, and somehow, that made all the difference. At first, I kept things surface level. I answered her questions with just enough detail to satisfy her reports and avoided anything personal. But Ellen had a way of asking questions that dug deeper than I was ready for. She didn't pry, but she didn't let me get away with vague answers either. Slowly, over the course of our meetings, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't expected. I told her about Karen and Steve, not all the gritty details, but enough for her to understand the depth of the betrayal. I talked about my kids, how much I missed them, and how hard it was to see them in such limited, controlled circumstances. I even admitted to the bitterness I carried, the quiet resentment that had become my constant companion. She didn't judge me for it. Instead, she asked questions that made me think, about what I wanted, about the kind of man I was trying to be. Ellen had this way of reframing things, of showing me a perspective I hadn't considered. She pointed out how much of my energy was spent on anger and revenge, how it was holding me back from the things I claimed to want most: stability, peace, and a stronger relationship with my kids. She didn't say it in a condescending way. She said it like someone who had seen too many people walk the same path I was on and knew where it led. Her words stuck with me, even when I didn't want to hear them. Over time, our conversations shifted. They weren't just about checking boxes on her forms anymore. They became moments of reflection, of clarity. She challenged me to focus on what I could control, to let go of the things that were dragging me down. It wasn't easy. Letting go of anger felt like losing a part of myself, like giving up the only weapon I had left. But Ellen's calm persistence made it hard to ignore the truth. Holding on to it wasn't helping me. It was only hurting me more. She also helped me see the cracks in my thinking. For months, I had justified my bitterness by telling myself it was for my kids, that everything I did was to protect them or to fight for them. But Ellen made me realize that my anger wasn't protecting anyone. It was just an excuse to stay stuck in the past. My kids didn't need a father consumed by revenge. They needed someone who could show up for them, someone who could be a steady, loving presence in their lives. One day, after a particularly difficult conversation, Ellen handed me a list of community programs, support groups, job placement services, even parenting workshops. At first, I was resistant. I didn't want to admit I needed help. But her voice stayed with me, urging me to take a step, any step, towards something better. Reluctantly, I signed up for a parenting class, figuring it couldn't hurt. To my surprise, it was actually helpful. The other parents there were dealing with their own struggles, and hearing their stories reminded me that I wasn't as alone as I felt. Ellen also nudged me toward finding more stable work. Through one of the programs she recommended, I landed a part-time job at a local hardware store. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was building something. The manager, a gruff older man named Ted, didn't care about my record as long as I showed up on time and did the work. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the weeks turned into months, I began to notice small changes in myself. The bitterness that had once felt so all-consuming started to loosen its grip. I still had my moments, of course. Flashes of anger when I thought about Karen and Steve, pangs of sadness when I missed my kids, but they didn't define me the way they used to. Slowly, I was learning to focus on what mattered. My kids, my job, and the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild my life. Ellen was a big part of that. She didn't just push me toward progress. She believed in it, even when I didn't. She saw something in me I had forgotten was there. A capacity to grow, to change, to find something better. And for the first time in a long time, I started to believe it too. Progress came in fragments. Small victories I clung to as proof that my life wasn't completely beyond saving. A full paycheck without deductions for overdue rent, an unsupervised visit with my kids, a conversation with my son where he smiled instead of looking away. These moments felt fragile, like I was holding onto pieces of something I'd lost and didn't fully deserve to reclaim. Through it all, Ellen remained a constant presence. She wasn't just my probation officer anymore. She had become something closer to a guide. She was relentless in her quiet encouragement, pushing me to see beyond the wreckage of my past. "Focus on what's in your hands now," she had said once, and those words stayed with me like an anchor, keeping me grounded when my thoughts threatened to drift toward anger and regret. The first real turning point came unexpectedly. It was during one of my visits with the kids, a Saturday afternoon spent at a park not far from Karen and Steve's new house. My daughter, Lily, had been quiet for most of the day, her usual chatter replaced by a thoughtful silence that worried me. I asked her what was wrong, expecting something trivial, but her answer knocked the wind out of me. "Mom and Steve argue a lot now," she said softly, her eyes on the swing set in front of her. "It makes me sad." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to lash out, to tell her how they had brought this on themselves, how their so-called happiness had always been a lie. But looking at her small, solemn face, I realized how cruel and pointless that would be. She didn't need my bitterness. She needed my comfort. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But no matter what happens, you can always talk to me, okay?" She nodded, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was doing something right. That moment shifted something in me. For so long, I had been consumed by my hatred for Karen and Steve, convinced that their downfall would somehow heal the wounds they'd left in me. But hearing my daughter's sadness reminded me that my revenge, no matter how justified it felt, would never fix what had been broken. If anything, it would only hurt the people I cared about most. I began to focus more on what I could control. I picked up extra shifts at the hardware store, saving every penny I could. I started attending parenting workshops regularly, learning how to navigate the complexities of co-parenting with Karen without letting my emotions get the best of me. It wasn't easy, especially when she continued to find subtle ways to remind me of my failures. But I kept my focus on the kids, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. Ellen noticed the change in me almost immediately. During one of our meetings, she asked what had shifted, and I told her about Lily's comment at the park. I expected her to offer one of her usual insightful observations, but instead, she just smiled. A small, quiet smile that carried more weight than words ever could. It was the first time I felt like I was on the right path, not just for my kids but for myself. As weeks turned into months, The bitterness that had once defined me began to fade. It didn't disappear entirely. There were still moments when I'd catch a glimpse of Karen and Steve together and feel the familiar sting of anger, but it no longer consumed me. I found myself focusing more on the life I was building, on the things I could control. I reconnected with old friends, cautiously at first, and was surprised to find that some of them had never fully believed Karen's version of events. Their support was tentative but genuine, and it gave me a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in a long time. The biggest milestone came when I was granted shared custody of the kids. It wasn't full custody, but it was more than I'd dared to hope for. The judge acknowledged the progress I'd made, and while Karen tried to argue against it, her case was weaker now. Steve's unemployment and their rumored financial troubles didn't help her credibility. For the first time in years, I felt like the system wasn't entirely stacked against me. Having the kids more often was a blessing, but it was also a challenge. I had to learn how to balance work, parenting, and the constant undercurrent of tension that came with co-parenting with Karen. There were awkward handoffs, passive-aggressive remarks, and the occasional outright argument, but I forced myself to stay calm. My kids didn't need more chaos in their lives, they needed stability, and I was determined to give it to them. Ellen continued to check in, though our meetings became less frequent as I met the conditions of my probation. On one of our last scheduled visits, she handed me a piece of paper with her personal email written on it. "If you ever need to talk," she said simply, and I understood it wasn't just professional courtesy. She believed in me, even when I struggled to believe in myself. By the end of that year, my life was far from perfect, but it was mine again. The anger that had once defined me was now a quiet shadow, something I could acknowledge without letting it control me. I was still rebuilding, still figuring out what kind of man I wanted to be, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a chance, a real chance to find something better. The first morning in my new apartment with the kids felt surreal. The sun streamed through the blinds, spilling golden light over the mismatched furniture I'd managed to scrape together. The smell of pancakes lingered in the air, a simple breakfast, but one that made the space feel like home. My son was sprawled on the couch with his favorite comic book, and Lily sat at the kitchen table, coloring a picture she proudly declared was, for Daddy. It was far from the life I had envisioned years ago, but it was mine, and it felt good. I hadn't seen Karen or Steve in a few weeks, aside from the hurried exchanges during custody handoffs. Those moments were still tense, but they didn't carry the same weight anymore. I no longer cared about their judgments or what narrative they spun about me to others. Their lives, messy as they were, no longer defined mine. I realized I didn't need to see their downfall to move forward. I had my own life to focus on, and that was enough. Ellen's influence remained a quiet but powerful presence. Though my probation had officially ended, she still checked in occasionally, always asking how the kids were doing or if I'd taken time for myself. It wasn't romantic, not yet, at least, but there was an ease to our conversations that made me wonder if it could be. She had seen me at my worst and helped guide me through it, and for that, I felt a sense of gratitude I couldn't quite put into words. One day, after dropping the kids off at school, I found myself parked outside a local coffee shop where Ellen had mentioned she liked to go. I hadn't planned to see her, but there she was, sitting by the window with a book in her hands, her brow furrowed in concentration. For a moment, I debated leaving, unsure if I was ready for what might come next. But then she looked up and saw me, her face breaking into a warm smile that felt like an invitation. We talked for hours that day, about everything and nothing. She told me about her own struggles, about why she had chosen this line of work and how helping people like me gave her purpose. I shared things I hadn't even told myself, about the fear of failing my kids, the guilt of letting my anger consume me, and the cautious hope I now carried for the future. By the time we parted ways, something in me had shifted. For the first time, I felt like I could let someone in again. Over the next few months, Ellen and I grew closer. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. There were no grand gestures or dramatic confessions. It was quiet and steady, built on trust and mutual understanding. She never pushed me to be more than I was ready for, and I respected her for that. The kids adored her, and she had a way of connecting with them that felt natural, unforced. Watching her laugh with them or help Lily with her homework filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. Life wasn't perfect, but it was better. I had a steady job, a stable home, and a growing relationship with my kids. The anger that had once consumed me was now a distant memory, replaced by something far more valuable: peace. I no longer felt the need to punish Karen or Steve for what they had done. They were a chapter of my life I had closed, and I had no intention of reopening it. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, as the kids played in the backyard and Ellen sat beside me on the porch, I felt a sense of contentment I hadn't thought possible. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined me. I was a father, a friend, and perhaps, one day, a partner again. For the first time in a long time, I felt like the pieces of my life were falling into place. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I thought about everything that had brought me here. The pain, the betrayal, the anger, and the slow, arduous climb out of it all. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was a life I had built, one step at a time. And as I watched my kids laugh and play, their joy echoing in the evening air, I knew it was a life worth living.